The sheriff's deputy was standing on my porch at 6 in the morning, his hand resting on his radio, asking me to step outside with my hands visible. Behind him, I could see Karen Whitmore standing by the gate, her arms crossed, wearing that satisfied smirk I'd grown to despise. "Ma'am, we've received a report that you're trespassing on private property," the deputy said, his voice professional but firm. "The complainant says this cabin doesn't belong to you." I looked past him at Karen, who was now filming everything with her phone, and felt something break inside my chest. This woman had just accused me of trespassing on land my family had owned for over 70 years. Land that included not just this lakefront cabin, but the entire ranch stretching back into the mountains. Land that made me one of the largest private property owners in the entire county. My name is Eleanor Hartwell. I'm 73 years old, and I'm about to tell you how a vindictive neighbor nearly stole everything my grandfather built and how I fought back with weapons she never saw coming. Let me take you back to the beginning, because understanding how deep this betrayal runs is essential to appreciating just how spectacular Karen's downfall would eventually be. Pine Ridge Lake sits nestled in a valley about 2 hours north of Denver, surrounded by towering pines and peaks that scrape the sky. It's the kind of place that makes city people pull over just to breathe the air and remember what peace feels like. My great-grandfather, Samuel Hartwell, discovered this valley in 1949 when he was scouting locations for a lumber operation that never materialized. What he found instead was something far more valuable than timber. He found home. Samuel purchased 1,800 acres for what amounted to pocket change by today's standards. The land included 3 miles of pristine lake frontage, old-growth forests, meadows full of wildflowers, and streams so clear you could count pebbles on the bottom from 20 feet up. He built the main ranch house on a bluff overlooking the entire valley, a sprawling log structure that could house his growing family and the occasional hunting party. But it was the lake cabin that captured everyone's heart. Samuel constructed it in 1952 as an anniversary gift for my great-grandmother Ruby. Every log was hand-selected, every stone in the massive fireplace personally chosen from the lakeshore. The cabin sat just 30 feet from the water's edge, surrounded by towering pines that had been growing since before the Civil War. From the wraparound porch, you could watch eagles fish in the morning mist and deer come down to drink at twilight. The property stayed in our family through 3 generations. My grandfather expanded the ranch operations, building guest cabins for hunting parties and a small marina for the handful of boats we kept on the lake. My father inherited everything in 1978 and chose to preserve rather than develop, turning down offers from resort companies and subdivision developers who wanted to transform our private paradise into a tourist destination. When my parents passed in a car accident in 2003, I inherited the entire estate. My husband Frank and I had been living in Minneapolis, where he worked as an engineer and I taught high school literature. The inheritance changed everything. We sold our suburban house, packed up our lives, and moved to Colorado to become full-time caretakers of a legacy that stretched back 7 decades. Those first years at Pine Ridge were magical. Frank loved the solitude and spent his retirement building furniture in the workshop my grandfather had constructed behind the main house. I found peace in the rhythm of seasonal maintenance, opening the guest cabins each spring, closing them each fall, maintaining the trails, and simply being present in a place that had sheltered 4 generations of my family. The lake cabin became our primary residence. While the ranch house was grander and more spacious, the cabin felt intimate and alive with family history. Every evening, we'd sit on that porch and watch the sunset paint the water gold, knowing we were experiencing the same view that had captivated my great-grandmother 70 years earlier. But paradise has a way of attracting people who want to claim it for themselves. The Pine Ridge Community Association came into existence in 2008 long after our family had established its presence in the valley. As more people built homes around the lake's perimeter, someone decided the area needed organization and professional management. The association was supposed to handle common concerns like road maintenance, snow removal, and coordinating with local emergency services. Frank and I joined willingly. We believed in being good neighbors, and the monthly dues of $35 seemed reasonable for maintaining the private road that connected all the lake properties to the county highway. The original board consisted of 5 property owners who met quarterly to discuss practical matters. Their biggest controversy was whether to allow motorboats over a certain horsepower rating. Frank passed away in his sleep in January 2018, leaving me alone in a house full of memories and a property too large for one elderly woman to maintain properly. The grief was overwhelming, but the land itself provided comfort. Every morning, I'd walk the trails Frank had maintained, sit by the lake where we'd shared 30 years of sunsets, and feel his presence in the familiar rhythms of seasonal change. That's when Karen Brennan moved in. Karen purchased the Morrison property in late 2018, a modest 3-bedroom house about a quarter-mile down the shore from my cabin. The Morrisons had been wonderful neighbors for over a decade, quiet retirees who kept to themselves and never caused problems. When they decided to move closer to their grandchildren in Arizona, their property sold within a week to a cash buyer. I should have paid more attention to that detail. Cash purchases often indicate either extraordinary wealth or questionable financing, and Karen Brennan was definitely not wealthy by any conventional measure. My first meeting with Karen happened on a crisp October morning when she appeared at my door carrying a casserole dish and wearing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Eleanor, I'm Karen, your new neighbor. I brought you some tuna casserole to welcome myself to the community." She was a small woman in her early 50s, with carefully styled blonde hair and the kind of restless energy that made me immediately uncomfortable. She talked rapidly, her eyes constantly scanning my property while maintaining conversation. "This is such a beautiful place," she gushed, stepping past me into the cabin without invitation. "Though I have to say, some of the properties around here could use updating. It's important to maintain standards, don't you think?" I felt the first prickle of warning. In my experience, neighbors who talked about standards usually meant they wanted to impose their preferences on everyone else. "The lake community has always been fairly relaxed about property maintenance," I replied carefully. "Most of us value privacy and natural beauty over uniformity." Karen's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Oh, I'm sure that worked fine in the past. But with property values rising, we all have a responsibility to protect our investments. Don't you agree?" She spent another 20 minutes touring my cabin without permission, making observations about outdated fixtures and inefficient layouts while I struggled to remain polite. When she finally left, I found myself locking the door behind her, something I'd never done in 15 years of living at the lake. 2 months later, Karen was elected to the Pine Ridge Community Association Board. The election itself should have been a warning sign. 3 of the 5 board positions were up for renewal, and Karen had somehow convinced 2 of her friends to purchase properties in the community just in time to qualify as candidates. They ran on a platform of modernization and professional management, promising to bring the association into the 21st century. Most longtime residents didn't bother voting. Why would they? The association had functioned smoothly for over a decade with minimal interference in anyone's life. But Karen's faction organized aggressively, knocking on doors, making phone calls, and emphasizing the need for responsible leadership in an evolving community. They won all 3 seats. Karen's first act as board president was to hire a property management company from Denver to professionalize association operations. Suddenly, we had a property manager who knew nothing about our community, monthly inspections for compliance violations, and a thick manual of rules that nobody had ever seen before. The second act was raising monthly dues to $150. These increases are necessary to fund proper maintenance and professional services, Karen announced at the January 2019 board meeting. We can no longer rely on volunteer labor and informal arrangements. Several longtime residents objected, pointing out that the community had managed perfectly well for over a decade without professional management or formal compliance inspections. Karen's response was swift and dismissive. "I understand that change can be difficult," she said with condescending patience. "But we have a fiduciary responsibility to protect property values and ensure community standards. Those who prefer a more casual approach might find other communities better suited to their preferences." That was the moment I realized Karen Brennan wasn't interested in improving our community. She was interested in controlling it. Over the following months, Karen's true agenda became clear. The property management company began issuing violation notices for infractions that had never existed before: grass that was insufficiently maintained, exterior paint that was not within approved color guidelines, and landscaping that failed to meet community aesthetic standards. Every violation came with inspection fees, compliance deadlines, and escalating penalties for non-compliance. The association's operating budget tripled, with most of the money going to the Denver management company and various consulting services that nobody could clearly explain. But the harassment remained relatively mild until Karen made her first move against my property directly. In June 2019, I received a violation notice claiming that my lake cabin was improperly positioned relative to property setback requirements and needed to be evaluated for compliance. The notice was signed by Karen as board president and co-signed by the property management company. I called Karen immediately, assuming there had been some mistake. "Karen, I received this violation notice about my cabin's setback requirements. There must be some confusion. The cabin was built in 1952, long before any association existed." Her response was coolly professional. "Eleanor, I understand your confusion, but existing structures aren't exempt from current community standards. We've hired a surveyor to assess all lakefront properties for compliance with modern setback requirements." Modern setback requirements? Karen, this cabin predates your association by over 50 years. It has grandfather rights. I'm afraid that's not accurate, Eleanor. The community covenants require all structures to maintain appropriate distances from water features and property boundaries. The surveyor will determine whether your cabin meets current standards. What community covenants? I've been here for 20 years, and I've never seen any document requiring lakefront cabins to meet specific setback measurements. There was a pause, and when Karen spoke again, her voice carried a hint of the satisfaction I would come to recognize as dangerous. "Eleanor, perhaps you should review the documentation you received when you joined the association. All property owners are bound by the community covenants, regardless of when their structures were built." After hanging up, I spent hours searching through files, trying to find any document that mentioned setback requirements or structural compliance standards. I found the original association membership paperwork Frank and I had signed in 2008, but it contained nothing about building codes or retroactive compliance requirements. The surveyor arrived the following week, a young man with expensive equipment who spent 3 hours measuring distances and taking photographs. He was polite but unhelpful when I asked about the purpose of his assessment. "I'm just gathering data, ma'am. The association will review my report and determine any necessary actions." 2 weeks later, I received the surveyor's report along with a formal notice of violation. According to the surveyor, my cabin sat 28 feet from the lake's high water mark. According to newly discovered community covenants, all structures were required to maintain a minimum 50-foot setback from water features. The violation notice gave me 90 days to achieve compliance by either moving the cabin or demolishing it entirely. I stared at that document for a long time, sitting in the same kitchen where my great-grandmother had prepared meals for 7 decades, looking out at the same lake view that had inspired my great-grandfather to build this cabin as a monument to love and family. Karen Brennan was trying to force me to destroy the heart of my family's legacy over a made-up rule that existed nowhere in any legitimate document. That night, I called my attorney. Thomas Gardner had handled Frank's estate and our various legal needs for over 15 years. He listened patiently as I explained the situation, asked several pointed questions about the association's claims, and promised to investigate the legitimacy of their violation notice. Eleanor, HOA disputes can be complicated, but what you're describing sounds suspicious. Legitimate associations don't retroactively apply new construction standards to existing structures without clear legal authority. So you think I can fight this? I think we need to examine the actual community covenants very carefully. If Karen Brennan is claiming authority she doesn't have, she's opening herself to serious legal consequences. Thomas's investigation took 3 weeks and revealed something that stunned both of us. The community covenants Karen had referenced didn't exist. The Pine Ridge Community Association had never filed any document establishing construction standards, setback requirements, or compliance protocols. The association's legal authority was limited to basic community services like road maintenance and snow removal. Karen Brennan had fabricated the entire violation claim. "Eleanor, this is fraud," Thomas told me during our follow-up meeting. "Karen has created false documentation to support illegitimate claims against your property. We need to confront this immediately." But when Thomas contacted the association demanding proof of their legal authority to enforce setback requirements, Karen's response revealed the true scope of her manipulation. She claimed that the covenants had always existed but had been misfiled in county records. She produced a document dated 2008 that established extensive community standards, including the 50-foot setback requirement that threatened my cabin. Thomas examined the document and immediately identified it as fraudulent. The paper was wrong, the signatures were questionable, and most damning of all, the document referenced community standards that didn't exist until 2019. "She's not just making false claims," Thomas explained. "She's actually creating forged documents to support those claims. This is criminal fraud." That's when I realized Karen Brennan wasn't just a controlling neighbor trying to impose her preferences on the community. She was a criminal who had targeted my property for reasons I didn't yet understand. But I was about to discover that Karen's fraud was just the beginning, and her ultimate goal was far more devastating than forcing me to move a 70-year-old cabin. Armed with Thomas's legal analysis, proving the fraudulent nature of Karen's claims, I felt confident that exposing her deception would end this nightmare quickly. I couldn't have been more wrong about the depths of her manipulation or the extent of her support within the community. The October 2019 board meeting was packed with residents who had heard rumors about the setback controversy. I arrived early, carrying copies of Thomas's legal analysis and the original association documents that proved Karen's covenants were fabricated. Karen called the meeting to order with the efficiency of someone accustomed to controlling every aspect of community business. She looked perfectly professional in her Navy business suit, projecting authority and competence. "Before we address routine business," she announced, "we need to discuss a serious compliance issue that affects the entire community." She gestured toward me with what appeared to be genuine concern. "Eleanor Hartwell has been living in a structure that violates our community setback requirements. Despite months of patient discussion, she has refused to achieve compliance." The room buzzed with surprised murmurs. Most residents had no idea about the violation notice or the setback requirements Karen claimed to be enforcing. I stood up, my voice shaking with indignation. Karen, I have proof that your setback requirements don't exist. My attorney has confirmed that the community covenants you're citing are fraudulent documents. Karen's expression didn't change, but I caught a flicker of something cold in her eyes. Eleanor, I understand you're upset about this situation. Change can be difficult, but accusations of fraud are serious matters that shouldn't be made lightly. She held up a thick folder. I have documentation from the county recorder's office confirming that our community covenants were properly filed and legally binding. Would you like to review these documents? The folder contained what appeared to be official county records, complete with filing stamps and bureaucratic signatures. To anyone without legal training, the documents looked absolutely legitimate. Thomas had warned me this might happen. Fraudulent documents can be very convincing, he'd said. Karen has clearly invested significant time and money in making her claims appear official. I held up my own folder. I have a legal analysis from Thomas Gardner, proving these documents are forgeries. The paper is wrong, the dates are inconsistent, and the signatures don't match county records. Eleanor, Karen said with patronizing patience, Mr. Gardner is your personal attorney. Of course, he's going to support your position. We've consulted with our own legal counsel, and they've confirmed the validity of our community standards. She turned to address the room directly. This isn't personal. We all care about Eleanor, and we understand her emotional attachment to her cabin. But we can't allow one resident to ignore community standards just because compliance is inconvenient. The room was dividing before my eyes. I could see neighbors who had been friendly for years now, looking at me with suspicion and disapproval. Karen had positioned herself as the reasonable authority figure, enforcing legitimate rules, while I appeared to be a stubborn troublemaker making wild accusations. The association board has voted to give Eleanor an additional 60 days to achieve compliance, Karen continued. If she chooses to continue ignoring community standards, we'll be forced to pursue legal remedies. After the meeting, I approached several neighbors who had seemed sympathetic, hoping to explain the true situation. Their responses were disheartening. Eleanor, I'm sure this will work out, said Janet Morrison, whose husband had been on the original board. But you have to understand Karen's position. She's trying to protect everyone's property values. Maybe you could just move the cabin back a few feet? Suggested Bob Chen, who lived 2 houses down. It seems like a reasonable compromise. Nobody wanted to hear about fraudulent documents or criminal conspiracy. They wanted a simple resolution that would restore community harmony without requiring them to take sides or question Karen's authority. That night, sitting alone in my cabin, I realized how cleverly Karen had manipulated the situation. By positioning herself as the defender of community standards and property values, she had made opposition to her schemes appear selfish and unreasonable. My neighbors weren't supporting criminal fraud. They were supporting what they believed to be legitimate community governance. But I was about to discover that Karen's manipulation extended far beyond fabricated documents and community politics. 2 weeks after the board meeting, I received a phone call that changed everything. Mrs. Hartwell? This is Rebecca Foster from Mountain Vista Development Corporation. I understand you might be interested in selling your lake property. I was stunned. I'm sorry, who is this? I've never expressed any interest in selling my property. Oh, I apologize for the confusion. We received information suggesting you were experiencing difficulties with community compliance and might be open to discussing a sale. My blood ran cold. Who gave you that information? I'm not at liberty to say, but we specialize in purchasing properties that have become burdensome for their owners. We could offer a quick cash transaction that would resolve any compliance issues. What kind of offer? Well, we'd need to conduct a formal appraisal, but for a quick sale with compliance complications, we could probably offer around $200,000 for your lake cabin property. I almost laughed, except the situation was too sinister for humor. My lake cabin sat on prime waterfront acreage that was easily worth 10 times that amount. Even with imaginary compliance problems, the offer was insultingly low. "I'm not interested in selling," I said firmly. "I understand, Mrs. Hartwell, but please keep our card." Sometimes these community disputes become more stressful than people anticipate. We're here if circumstances change. After hanging up, I called Thomas immediately. "They're not just trying to force me to move my cabin," I told him. "They're trying to force me to sell my property entirely." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "Eleanor, this is starting to look like a very sophisticated land grab scheme. Someone has identified your property as valuable and is using the association to create pressure for a below-market sale. But who would do something like that? And why target me specifically? Think about it. You own the largest and most valuable property in the community. You're elderly, widowed, and isolated. To a criminal developer, you look like the perfect target." That conversation led to the most terrifying realization of this entire ordeal. I wasn't just dealing with a controlling neighbor who wanted to impose her preferences on the community. I was dealing with organized criminals who had identified my property as their target and were using the association as a weapon to steal it. The harassment escalated dramatically over the following months. In December 2019, I received a notice that the association was imposing a special assessment of $1,500 per property to fund legal expenses related to compliance enforcement. The assessment was due within 30 days, with interest and penalties for late payment. In January 2020, I found strange tire tracks in my driveway and evidence that someone had been walking around my property at night. When I reported this to the county sheriff, they advised me to install security cameras but said they couldn't investigate without evidence of actual trespassing. In February, the association's property management company began conducting compliance inspections of my property twice per week. They would arrive unannounced, photograph everything, and leave violation notices for infractions like improperly stored firewood and unapproved exterior decorations. Each violation carried inspection fees, administrative costs, and escalating penalties. By March, the association claimed I owed over $4,000 in fines and fees related to various compliance failures. But the psychological warfare was even more devastating than the financial pressure. My neighbors had completely turned against me. People who had been friends for decades now crossed the street to avoid speaking to me. The few who still acknowledged my existence did so with pity rather than support. "Eleanor, you're making this harder than it needs to be," said Martha Kowalski, who had been my closest friend in the community. "Karen is just trying to help everyone maintain their property values. Why can't you just cooperate?" The isolation was crushing. After Frank's death, the community had been my support system, my connection to the world beyond my property's boundaries. Now I felt like a pariah in my own neighborhood, surrounded by people who viewed me as a selfish troublemaker disrupting their peaceful community. The loneliness was made worse by the constant stress of legal and financial pressure. Every day brought new violation notices, new fees, new threats of legal action. I was spending thousands of dollars on attorney fees while watching my property become the subject of hostile scrutiny from the entire community. By April 2020, I was seriously considering surrender. The fight was consuming my savings, destroying my health, and isolating me from every social connection I had left. Karen's strategy was working perfectly. She was making resistance more costly and painful than capitulation. That's when the breakthrough came from an unexpected source. I was checking my mail on a warm spring morning when a young man approached me from the direction of the county road. He looked to be in his late 20s, professionally dressed, carrying a clipboard, and wearing the expression of someone with unpleasant news to deliver. "Mrs. Hartwell?" I'm David Kim from the County Assessor's Office. I need to speak with you about your property taxes. My heart sank. After months of legal fees and association fines, a tax problem was the last thing I could handle. What kind of problem? I asked wearily. Well, it's not exactly a problem, David said, looking confused. It's more of a discrepancy. According to our records, you own 1,800 acres in this valley, but you've only been paying taxes on about 3 acres around your lake cabin. I stared at him in shock. I'm sorry, what? David consulted his clipboard. The Hartwell Family Trust owns everything from the county road back to the national forest boundary. But somehow your tax assessment has been limited to just the immediate cabin area. We're trying to figure out how that happened. The world seemed to tilt sideways. For 20 years, I had been paying property taxes on only a tiny fraction of my actual land holdings. Either there had been a massive bureaucratic error, or someone had been manipulating county records to hide the true extent of my property. David, can you show me exactly what land the county says I own? He pulled out a detailed survey map and spread it across the hood of his car. The highlighted area covered everything I could see from my cabin and much, much more. Mountains, forests, meadows, and streams stretching back for miles into the wilderness. According to this survey, your property includes most of the watershed that feeds Pine Ridge Lake, David explained. You own the entire northern shore, 3 tributary streams, and about 4 miles of the county road that everyone uses to access their properties. I felt dizzy with the implications. David, are you saying that everyone else in this community is technically on my land? He consulted his clipboard again. Well, not exactly. Most of them have legitimate easements or deed rights to their specific lots. But the road access, the community center, and several of the common areas, yes, those appear to be on your property. That's when I understood why Karen Brennan had targeted me so aggressively. She wasn't just trying to steal my cabin and immediate acreage. She was trying to steal control of the most valuable private property in the entire region land that I didn't even know I owned. But more importantly, I now had a weapon Karen never saw coming. If I owned the road that provided access to everyone's property, I had leverage that could turn this entire conflict upside down. The war was about to begin in earnest, and for the first time in months, I was the one with the superior firepower. The revelation about my property boundaries sent me into a state of shock that lasted for days. I walked every trail on the land Frank and I had maintained, trying to reconcile what I thought I knew with what the county records revealed. Every stream, every meadow, every grove of ancient pines, it was all mine. My great-grandfather hadn't just purchased a lake cabin site. He had bought an empire. Thomas Gardner's reaction to David Kim's survey was immediate and decisive. Eleanor, this changes everything. If you own the access road and the community center, you have legal authority that supersedes anything the association can claim. We spent hours poring over historical property records, deed transfers, and survey maps dating back to my great-grandfather's original purchase. The documentation was clear and unambiguous. The Hartwell Family Trust owned nearly 2,000 acres of prime mountain property, including most of the infrastructure that the Pine Ridge community depended on. How did we miss this for 20 years? I asked Thomas. Someone has been very carefully manipulating your tax assessments to hide the true extent of your holdings, he replied grimly. This level of bureaucratic fraud requires inside knowledge and systematic corruption. We requested copies of every property tax document filed since my parents' deaths. What we discovered was a pattern of deliberate deception spanning 2 decades. Someone had been filing amended assessments that consistently reduced my taxable property to just the cabin and immediate surroundings. The paper trail led directly to Karen Brennan. Look at this, Thomas said, pointing to a tax amendment filed in 2019. This document reduces your assessed property by over 1,500 acres, and it's co-signed by Karen Brennan as community representative. My hands trembled as I reviewed the fraudulent paperwork. Karen hadn't just moved to Pine Ridge and decided to harass me randomly. She had been researching my property for years, manipulating county records, and positioning herself to steal everything my family had built. Thomas, this is criminal conspiracy on a massive scale. She's been planning this theft for years. It gets worse, Eleanor. I've been investigating Mountain Vista Development Corporation, the company that offered to buy your cabin. Karen Brennan is listed as a principal partner. The scope of the fraud was breathtaking. Karen had moved to Pine Ridge specifically to execute a long-term plan to steal my property through bureaucratic manipulation and community pressure. She had infiltrated the association, corrupted county records, and enlisted my own neighbors as unwitting accomplices in her scheme. But now, I knew something Karen didn't realize I knew. And I was about to use that knowledge to destroy her completely. The first step was securing my legal position. Thomas filed emergency motions with the county court, documenting the fraudulent tax assessments and demanding immediate correction of the property records. Within 2 weeks, my tax bill reflected the true extent of my holdings and my legal authority over community infrastructure. The second step was more dramatic. On a crisp Monday morning in May 2020, I drove to the community center, where Karen was holding one of her weekly compliance review meetings. Instead of attending as a supplicant seeking mercy, I arrived as the property owner asserting legal authority over the building where they were meeting. Karen looked surprised to see me, but maintained her professional composure. "Eleanor, how nice that you decided to join us. We were just discussing your compliance status." "Actually, Karen, we need to discuss your compliance status." I placed a thick folder on the table in front of her. "These are corrected property records from the county assessor's office. As it turns out, I own the land this building sits on. I also own the access road everyone used to get here this morning." The room fell silent. Karen opened the folder with trembling hands, her face growing pale as she reviewed the survey maps and legal documents. "This building, the parking area, and most of the common spaces you've been claiming association authority over are actually on my private property," I continued. "Which means you've been trespassing for the past 2 years." Karen's carefully maintained mask finally slipped. "This is impossible. These documents must be forgeries." "They're certified copies from the county recorder's office," Thomas said, stepping into the room behind me. "Unlike the fabricated covenants you've been using to harass my client." The other board members looked confused and frightened. They had trusted Karen's leadership without questioning her authority or investigating her claims. Now they were discovering that their president had been lying to them for years. "Eleanor, we didn't know," stammered Janet Morrison. "Karen told us the association had legal authority for community management." "I understand that, Janet. You were deceived just like I was. But now we all know the truth." I turned back to Karen, who was staring at the property documents with the expression of someone watching her world collapse. "Karen, you have 48 hours to remove all association property from my land. That includes this building, the signs, and any equipment you've installed. After that, you'll be trespassing and I'll have you arrested." "You can't do this," she whispered. "Actually, I can. And I will. Unless you want to discuss a different arrangement." Karen looked up sharply, sensing a possible escape route. "I am willing to grant the association a lease for continued use of this property," I said. "The terms are simple: immediate resignation of the current board, dissolution of all fraudulent community covenants, dismissal of all violation notices against my property, and reimbursement of all legal fees I've incurred fighting your harassment." "That's extortion," Karen snapped. "No, that's justice. You tried to steal my property through fraud and manipulation. Now you get to choose between losing everything or accepting reasonable terms for continued community access. The other board members were looking at Karen with growing suspicion and anger. They were beginning to understand how thoroughly they had been manipulated. "Karen, is this true?" asked Bob Chen. "Have you been filing false documents?" Karen's response revealed the desperation beneath her controlled exterior. "You don't understand the big picture. Eleanor's property is worth millions if it's developed properly. We could all benefit from professional management." "Professional management that you would control?" Thomas interjected. "Professional management through your development company?" The room erupted in angry voices as Karen's deception became clear to everyone present. She had been using the association to pressure me into selling valuable property to her own company at below-market prices. But Karen wasn't finished fighting. As the meeting dissolved into chaos and recriminations, she stood up with the composure of someone playing a final card. "Eleanor, you may own this land, but you're still bound by county zoning regulations and state environmental laws. If you interfere with community access to this lake, you'll face legal challenges that will cost you everything you have." She smiled coldly. "I've spent 2 years researching every possible legal angle. Even if you own the access road, you can't legally restrict community use without environmental impact studies and county approval. Those processes take years and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars." "You're right about the legal complexity," I replied calmly, "which is why I'm not restricting community access. I'm simply requiring proper leases and liability insurance for use of my property." I pulled out another set of documents. Effective immediately, every property owner who wants continued access to the lake will need to sign a lease agreement with the Hartwell Family Trust. The terms are reasonable: $50 per month per property, plus liability insurance. Karen's face went white. "You can't charge people for access to their own properties. I can charge people for crossing my property to reach their lots. And I can require them to follow legitimate rules instead of the fabricated covenants you've been enforcing." Thomas stepped forward with additional paperwork. "We've also filed criminal charges against Karen Brennan for fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit theft. The county prosecutor is very interested in her tax manipulation scheme." The meeting dissolved completely as neighbors began arguing among themselves and demanding explanations from Karen. Several people approached me to apologize and ask about the lease arrangements. Others stormed out, apparently still believing Karen's claims about association authority. But Karen herself had disappeared during the chaos, slipping away while everyone else was focused on the shocking revelations about property ownership and criminal fraud. I should have expected her to escalate rather than surrender. I should have anticipated that someone willing to commit fraud on this scale wouldn't be deterred by legal exposure or community condemnation. 3 days later, I discovered just how dangerous a cornered criminal could be. The sound of breaking glass woke me at 2 in the morning. I lay in bed for a moment, disoriented, thinking perhaps a branch had fallen against a window during the spring storm that had been building all evening. Then I heard footsteps on my porch. Someone was trying to break into my cabin. I reached for the phone to call 911, but the line was dead. My cell phone showing no signal, not unusual in the mountains, but terrifying under the circumstances. I was alone, isolated, and someone was attempting to break into my home in the middle of the night.